All right, we're going to go ahead and continue our 8.2 section. This time, though, we're going to be factoring by grouping. Now, in factoring by grouping, you're going to ask yourself a few questions. First one is, what do they have in common? So you're going to go ahead and look at the problem. You're going to identify what they have in common, and initially, they're going to have a nice set of parentheses in common. That may be at the very beginning, or you may have to find out what that set of parentheses is. We're also going to be using some of our basic factoring skills, which also relates to our distributive property skills. So if you notice right here, AB and AC, they have an A in common. So that's why it goes in the front of the parentheses. But if you wanted to check it, you could always say A times B. That gives you AB. And then A times C, that also gives you AC. So for our first problem here, I'm going to notice that I have my parentheses. They are actually the same, and that's great. We have it in common. I've got my C plus D and my C plus D. So I'm going to go ahead and write and mention that I have C plus D in common. Now, if that's the case, which we hope it is, I'm going to go ahead and underline what I call the leftovers. We all love leftovers, especially after our big holiday food fests. So I'm going to go ahead and underline my 2 and my plus B. Now, the way I like to go ahead and put my answer, yes, we're almost to our answer, is I like putting the leftovers at the very front of the answer. Some people like putting it at the back. So I'm going to go ahead and write my answer as 2 plus B times the quantity C plus D. Now, if you remember, they only have C plus D in common, so that's why I write it once, just one time there. Our next problem is very similar. I've got parentheses to start off with, but if you notice, they're not exactly the same. They don't have it in common yet. But if you notice, B plus 1, that is awfully similar to 1 plus B. So that means if I'm able to maybe fix the order, I think I would be able to have it in common. But if you notice at the same time, something is missing here, you all know what it is. Say it with me. That's right. You're Juan. So when I fix the order, I need to go ahead and write Juan because we love him so much. If you notice, I do have my parentheses here in common, and that allows me to go ahead and find my answer. So I go ahead and underline my leftovers there. And again, it's really quick. I just go ahead and make my answer. 3B minus 1 goes in front. That's what I like doing. That's in parentheses. And then since they have B plus 1 in common, I just need to write it one time. Now this one here is going to be a little bit more complicated because if you notice your parentheses, they are very similar, but we actually have minus signs. Now in years past, I used to teach the true proper way of being able to fix that, but most students have found it pretty easy once they recognize that they're not equal to each other, so I cannot go ahead and make my answer as quick as I would like. I do notice that I can fix it though. I can just change my order from 3 minus y to y minus 3, but if I do that, if I fix it, the negative 2 right here actually needs to become positive 2, or the opposite. So it means if I had a positive 5 here, it would actually become the opposite, or negative 5. If I had a positive 7, it would become negative 7. If I had a negative 9, it'd become a positive 9. It's the opposite. With that little trick, if you can understand that, I am able to find my answer really quick like we did on example A and example B. I notice that I've got my binomials, the parentheses here, exactly the same, so I can find my answer. Again, this one was a little trick, so you got to be careful when you're trying it on your own. I underline my leftovers. I go ahead and make my awesome answer really quick. Now for this one, if you notice, you don't have any parentheses to start with, so it means it's going to be a little bit more complicated. What I'd like you to do, though, to make it a little bit easier, is to go ahead and split it into 2 groups. Now, while splitting it into 2 groups may give you a little bit more extra to write. It's actually going to let you focus a little bit better. So I just go ahead and put my AB minus 2B on the left, and then my positive AC minus 2C on the right. Now what I need you to do is to look at each group separately. So on the left group here, I need you to notice that they have something in common. Very similar to what we did before. And instead of listing out everything, I think at this point we can just go ahead and identify that they have a B in common. So the left group, if I factor out a B would go in front of a parentheses, and I would have A minus 2 inside. Now to check again, B times A, that is AB, and B times negative 2, that is negative 2B. So I know I did that group correct. Now the other group, my second group here on the right, I notice that they have a C in common. Now if I factor out a C, just like I did for the left group, I'd have a positive C in the front, and then if you notice, I'd have an A minus 2 inside. Positive C times A is positive AC, and then positive C times negative 2 is negative 2C. Now if you notice, it's very similar to our first example, example A. I have an A minus 2 in common, so I just go ahead and identify my leftovers, and then I make my beautiful answer. This problem is very similar to our previous one. I'm going to go ahead and split it up into my two groups, just like we did on our previous example. I'm going to look at my left group first and notice that they have something in common. And I'm going to go ahead and say that they have an A in common. So I'm going to factor out this A. Now when you factor out an A, you've got to be a little bit careful, especially on this first term here. Now, factoring out an A, it's always wise to check it with multiplication to see if you have done it correctly. So A times A, does that give me A squared? And of course it does. A times B, does that give me positive AB? Yeah, so I did my first group correctly. Now the right group is going to be a little bit more challenging. If you notice that they both have a C in common, but some of you may notice something as well. What else do they have in common? That's correct. They have a negative sign in common. So for my right group, I'm going to go ahead and factor out a negative C. Now when I do that, I got to be extra careful, and that's the whole point in checking with multiplication. If I factor out my negative C, the question is, do I get my A plus B so that they can be in common? So I'm going to assume that they do, but I'm going to check to see if they actually get it A plus B. So negative C times A, that does give me negative AC. And then negative C times B, that does give me negative BC. So that is correct with the negative sign for my C. I notice that they got the nice parentheses in common, just like what we were hoping for. So I can go ahead and underline my leftovers and put my answer together. Again, if you wish to have the A minus C in the back instead of the front, that is okay, as long as it is A minus C and A plus B. All right, for our last example here, this is the whole reason we've been doing factoring by grouping. I'm going to ask us to do the following. I'm going to split it up into my two groups again. We're really getting you ready for high school factoring by looking at this problem here. Now, to make things a little bit easier for us, I'm actually going to go ahead and suggest that we concentrate on the right group. The right group obviously looks a lot easier. I don't have any variables in common, so it has to be a number. And if you notice, 2 and 6, they can both be divided or factored by 2. So I'm going to go ahead and factor out a 2 for the right group. Now, this gives me an idea if I've done it correctly. I'll check right now. I've got positive 2 times x, that does give me positive 2x. And then I have positive 2 times negative 3, that does give me negative 6. Now that kind of gives me a hint on what I will be looking for over here. Because again, I'm trying to find the same parentheses. So on the left group, I notice that they have in common x's. The question is, how many x's? Now, if I already know what I want, what I'm hoping to get, maybe that'll lead me to the right direction. Some of you super geniuses may already notice that they have two x's in common, also known as x squared. So the left group, if I factor out x squared, the question is, am I able to just put x minus 3 inside? So if I do x squared times x, does that give me x cubed? Yes, it does. And then finally, x squared times negative 3, does that give me negative 3x squared? Yes, it does. So I notice that they have x minus 3 in common, and this allows me to find my answer. Now later on, there may be some more complicated problems where you'd have to take your leftovers, which is our x squared plus 2 right now, and do some further factoring, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. We may have some more challenging problems at the end of Chapter 8 where that is required.